Somewhere in San Francisco right now, a 26-year-old with 3 employees and a laptop is sitting on a company that investors say is worth more than Delta Airlines. No factory, no inventory, no physical product you can hold in your hand, just code, a few servers he doesn't even own, and a pitch deck. Delta Airlines flies 400 aircraft and employs 90,000 people. This kid's startup has 12 people and a Slack channel, and yet, on paper, his company is worth more. That's not a typo. That's the strange, upside-down economics of the AI startup world in 2026, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how something so small can be valued so high, why most of these companies will never make a single dollar of profit, and why a handful of them will become the most powerful businesses on the planet. Let's rewind for a second, because to understand where we are, you need to understand what an AI startup actually is. Not the marketing version, the real one. Strip away the buzzwords, and an AI startup is usually one of 3 things. It's a company that builds its own foundation model from scratch, which is incredibly rare and incredibly expensive. It's a company that builds an application on top of someone else's model, which is the vast majority of them, or it's a company that sells the tools, chips, or infrastructure that the first 2 groups need to survive. Almost everyone you've heard of falls into that middle category. They didn't invent the engine. They built a car around it. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because starting one of these companies costs almost nothing compared to a traditional business, and also somehow costs an absolute fortune at the exact same time. Let that sit for a second, because it sounds like a contradiction, and it is one, and that contradiction is the entire story of this industry.
On one hand, the barrier to entry has basically collapsed. 10 years ago, if you wanted to build a piece of intelligent software, you needed a team of PhDs, years of research, and tens of millions of dollars just to get something that worked. Today, a solo developer with a laptop and an internet connection can call an existing AI model through an API, wrap a clean interface around it, and launch a working product in a weekend. Realistically, the startup cost for this kind of app layer AI business sits somewhere between $5,000 and $50,000. That covers your API usage, basic cloud hosting, a domain, and maybe a freelance designer. It is, by historical standards, absurdly cheap. But then there's the other side of the industry, the side that swallows money like nothing else in business history. If instead of building on top of someone else's model, you try to train your own from the ground up, the number stops looking like a startup budget and starts looking like a national infrastructure project. Training a serious, competitive large language model can cost anywhere from $50 million to over $1 billion, depending on the scale. And that number is before you've spent a single cent on marketing, salaries, or office space. Most of that money goes to one place: computing power. Specifically, the specialized chips called GPUs, made primarily by a company called NVIDIA, which has quietly become one of the most valuable companies on Earth, almost entirely because everyone building an AI model needs to buy hardware from them. It's a strange kind of gold rush where the company selling the shovels is worth more than most of the people digging. So already you can see the divide forming. There are the builders, thousands of small teams racing to create the next clever app on top of existing AI, spending relatively little and moving fast. And there are the founders, a much smaller, much better funded group trying to own the actual intelligence itself, spending like a government and betting everything on being one of the last companies standing when the dust settles.
Now let's talk about how these companies actually make money, because this is where a lot of outside observers get confused. They assume an AI startup makes money the way a normal software company does, through subscriptions. And sometimes that's true, but the honest picture is messier and far more interesting. Some charge a monthly subscription, the same model Netflix or Spotify use, where you pay a flat fee for unlimited or capped usage. Some charge per use, meaning every time you generate an image, run a query, or process a document, a tiny fraction of a cent gets billed to your account. and those fractions add up into serious revenue at scale. Others license their technology directly to bigger companies, essentially becoming an invisible engine running quietly inside somebody else's product. And a growing number don't charge the end user anything at all, instead selling access to the data, the insights, or the behavioral patterns that come from millions of people using their tool for free. If you've ever wondered why a shockingly good AI tool is completely free, that's usually the answer. You are not the customer. You are the product being refined. Here's the part almost nobody outside the industry realizes, though. Revenue and profit are two completely different animals in this world, and most of these companies are drowning in the gap between them. A startup can be bringing in $20 million a year in revenue and still be losing money, sometimes losing a lot of money, because the cost of actually running an AI model is brutal. Every single query a user sends, every image generated, every conversation held with a chatbot costs the company real money in computing power behind the scenes. This is fundamentally different from a normal software business, where once you've built the product, serving the millionth customer costs almost nothing extra. With AI, the millionth customer costs you nearly as much as the first one did. That's why you'll see headlines about AI startups raising hundreds of millions of dollars in funding while simultaneously reporting massive annual losses. And it's why some of the most talked about AI companies in the world have never turned a profit in their entire existence. They're not failing. They're playing an entirely different game, one where growth and market position matter more than profit, at least for now.
So, if profit isn't the immediate goal, what actually is? The honest answer is dominance. Investors aren't funding these companies expecting quarterly profits. They're funding a bet that whoever becomes essential first, whoever gets so deeply embedded into how people work, communicate, or create, becomes nearly impossible to replace later. It's the same playbook Amazon ran in its early years, bleeding cash for over a decade while investors kept writing checks, because everyone understood the real prize wasn't next year's earnings report, it was owning the entire category once the dust settled. Which brings us to the part of this story people love to skip past, the hidden costs, the stuff that never makes it into the glossy pitch deck. Talent is brutally expensive. A genuinely skilled machine learning engineer can command a salary well into the mid-six figures, and the very best researchers in the world have been known to receive compensation packages worth over $1 million a year, sometimes several million, because there are only so many people on the planet who actually understand how to build this technology at the frontier level. Then there's the compute bill, which never stops. Unlike a factory you build once, AI infrastructure is a subscription you can never cancel, because the moment you stop paying for computing power, your product stops working. And then there's the quietest cost of all, the one that's killed more startups than bad code ever has: data. Good AI needs enormous amounts of clean, relevant data to function well, and acquiring, cleaning, and legally licensing that data is its own expensive, exhausting battle, one that's increasingly landing companies in courtrooms as artists, writers, and publishers fight back over how their work was used without permission. And that leads us somewhere darker, because behind the sleek product demos and confident founders on stage, there's a psychological game being played, and it's one of pure fear. Nobody wants to be the company that got left behind. Venture capital firms are pouring money into AI startups, not always because they're certain a given company will succeed, but because they're terrified of missing the next Google, the next Amazon, the one that seemed too early or too risky until suddenly it wasn't. That fear creates a strange kind of momentum, where valuations climb not purely because of proven results, but because of what a company might become. It's a bet on a future everyone can feel coming, but nobody can fully predict. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes it so seductive and so dangerous.
Because for every dominant success story, there is a long, quiet graveyard of AI startups that raised millions, built something genuinely impressive, and still collapsed. Some ran out of cash waiting for revenue to catch up with expenses. Others got outpaced overnight when a larger company, one with more money and more computing power, simply released a free version of the exact same feature they were charging for. That's one of the cruelest risks in this industry. You can spend 2 years building something brilliant, and then a company like Google or Microsoft can bolt a similar feature directly into a product billions of people already use for free, and your entire business model evaporates in a single afternoon. And still, despite every one of those risks, the ones that make it through can become almost unbelievably valuable. Companies barely a few years old have reached valuations in the tens of billions of dollars, built on user bases that took traditional companies decades to accumulate. One well-known AI chatbot reportedly reached 100 million users faster than almost any consumer product in history, faster than Instagram, faster than TikTok. That kind of growth curve is what investors are chasing, because if you can capture that many users before your competitors even finish building their product, you don't just win the round, you potentially own the entire category for years to come. So where does that leave the answer to the question everyone actually wants answered? Does owning an AI startup actually make financial sense? The truth is uncomfortable, but it's the truth. For the vast majority of people who try, the answer is no. Most AI startups will spend more than they earn, chase a market that shifts beneath them every few months, and eventually shut down quietly, absorbed into the long list of ambitious ideas that simply ran out of runway. But for a small percentage, the ones that time the market correctly, secure the right funding, and build something people genuinely cannot live without, the payoff isn't just profitable, it's generational. It's the kind of wealth and influence that reshapes entire industries. And maybe that's the real lesson hiding underneath all the numbers. This isn't really a story about artificial intelligence at all. It's the oldest story in business dressed up in new language. Enormous risk chasing an even more enormous reward, with almost nothing solid in between to hold on to. The machines may be new, the bet being placed on them is as old as capitalism itself.